Thank you all so much for joining us today for The Legacy He Left Me. My name is Brenna Chase. I'm the Director of Communications and Training at MOVA. And I'm going to run through some very brief logistics before I pass it over to our presenter today. First and foremost, this is a webinar, so you all as the audience cannot be seen or heard. You should be able to see the presenter, the PowerPoint, as well as the ASL interpreters today. There will be time at the very end of the presentation to ask some questions. If you have questions throughout the presentation, we encourage you to use that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Drop your questions in there, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation. And as I said before, we do have ASL interpretation as well as CART captioning available during today's session. To view your closed captions, you'll want to go to the very bottom of the screen and click on that closed caption icon. There's a little up arrow on that icon. If you click on that and then click on show subtitle, you will be able to see the captions at that point. But if at any time you have issues accessing the closed captions or viewing the ASL interpreters, please feel free to reach out to myself in the chat function or my colleague Charlotte Hoff. If you can't see our names, you can just message all panelists and we will get back to you as soon as we can and try to help you out there. And with that, I will introduce our presenter today. Lovern Gordon is the founder of Love Life Now Foundation, Inc., which promotes awareness around domestic violence via its initiatives and helps bridge the gap between domestic violence shelters and communities they serve. She conducts domestic violence workshops and hosts events that raise thousands of dollars to benefit domestic violence shelters worldwide. She has appeared on numerous television and radio shows and has been featured in many print publications. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Lovern to you all today.
Thank you so much, Brenna. And I appreciate MOVA for the opportunity to present the Legacy He Left Me workshop this morning. And we're going to go ahead and get right into it because we're going to use up every single minute we have to make sure as much awareness is spread as possible. So the presentation, as mentioned, is called The Legacy He Left Me, and it surrounds my personal story as well as encompassing as much awareness as I mentioned around the issue of domestic violence. And so Love Life Now Foundation, as Brenna mentioned, surrounds eating, sleeping, and breathing the issue of abuse, domestic violence awareness year-round. We don't want the issue to be in the forefront when a celebrity is being affected by it, when an athlete is being profiled for it in the news. We really want to keep the focus going as much as we can because the more you know, we say prevention is cure. So that is what we do. This is us, is our team. We have Antonio, the lone soul guy on our team who helps present workshops, again, to colleges, high schools, sometimes with us. Myself, Rose out of Wells Fargo Bank, and Ebony out of State Street. This is our conglomerate. You typically see me, but they are the glue behind all that goes on with Love Life Now. And we promote year-round awareness through initiatives that we host in the community as well. So, educational workshops like this one, bedding drives that we host each year that, we collect sheets and pillows that goes back to DV agency of our choosing. This year it is Transition House that we are highlighting. Our White Ribbon Night Gala at the very corner bottom there, where we ask more men to speak out against domestic violence in our communities. Too often you hear us as women advocating for this cause, but when men have a voice, it's that more pertinent to other men that it's coming from. And it's patterned after the nationwide White Ribbon campaign and led by Jane Doe here in the state of Massachusetts. Then we have our Heal-a-thon, where we strap on a comfy pair of heels. Heels are not mandatory, but a lot of people do show up in them. In the last 2 or 3 years, we've had more men strapping on their Mary Janes and their little wedges to come out and walk a mile in support of awareness in Brockton. And we do it on a very busy street. And it's a way for people, again, to understand that walking a mile in a survivor's shoes doesn't compare to the pain that they experience when they're going through this issue, when they've left this issue, and when they've had to pick up their lives after this issue. So it's one of my favorite mornings that we were not able to do last year, but we will do hopefully sometime next year after things slow down with the pandemic. And then we also meet victims where they're at on the street, where we host our homeless brown bag and care. And we ask folks to come out and help us assemble bags of toiletries and a brown bag lunch that goes to the homeless on the street in hopes of reaching victims where they're at. So, you know, if we're experiencing domestic violence behind our four walls, you can imagine that on the streets, domestic violence is still very prevalent, and it's oftentimes the cause of why someone is homeless due to this issue. So we try to meet them where they're at to offer resources that they may not know about, oftentimes don't, and have them understand that they do deserve help. And then we have our Get Safe Fund that helps victims and survivors with domestic violence related expenses. So that can go anywhere from a hotel stay, because we've given them the resources to call for shelters, but they might be full. That helps put them up in a hotel motel for a couple nights, or, you know, toiletries, clothes, food that you had to leave behind, transportation from getting from one, you know, part of the state to another or out of state. Anything related to leaving and getting to that, you know, next piece of getting safe, that's what that fund helps with. So that's essentially what we do throughout the year in terms of initiatives. But again, we point people in the right direction for help overall. And then we also host these workshops like you're seeing this morning. So what is, let's go back. What is domestic violence? Well, I know a lot of folks on here are aware what the issue of domestic violence entails, but I like to sort of point it out because sometimes it gets lost in the wayside, right? Because many people are focused on one type of abuse, right? Or they're oftentimes seeing one type of abuse. But the CDC coins domestic violence as the willful intimidation of physical assault, sexual assault, and or other abusive behavior as part of a systematic pattern. So a pattern, not something that just happens today and may not happen again because the perpetrator says it's not going to. It is a pattern. So once it happens once, it will happen again. Systematic pattern of power and control perpetrated by one intimate partner against another. And that does not just have to be boyfriends. It can be a parent, it can be a friend. Once you have an intimate ongoing relationship with that person, it can be and is considered domestic violence. And it includes sexual violence, psychological violence, physical violence, and or emotional abuse. And so ACEs, I wanted to touch a little bit on ACEs because it's going to entail a lot of what my particular story surrounds and how it affected me, unbeknownst to me, as I grew older, experiencing this issue. So ACEs, by the CDC coined, is adverse childhood experiences. And it succinctly relates to traumatic experiences that a child experiences before the age of 17 to 18, that they then take in with them or follows them throughout their, teenage years and adulthood. And so what are some examples of traumatic experiences that are adverse childhood experiences? Well, domestic violence, so physical, emotional abuse as one, witnessing violence within the home, watching a mother be brutally or a parent be brutally attacked or being abused in the home, violence within the community that they live in, their surrounding environment. And so these experiences, and the more adverse child experiences you have, the more susceptible you are to experiencing, but adult obesity, depression, having suicidal thoughts, and maybe entering a domestic violence relationship when you are older. And so I come to this issue from a very, very personal place. I am a two-time survivor of the issue of domestic violence, once as a child witness, which is why we're touching on adverse childhood experiences, and as a child witness in Trinidad, where I grew up till I was the age of 15. And so for the 15 years of my life that I lived on the island, I witnessed our father brutally abusing our mother. And I will be very frank and say that It was machetes that he would sometimes use on her. It was beer bottles that he would break and sometimes stab her with. It was him bringing her outside the side of her house, the front of her house, and beating her while she was cornered on the ground in front of many neighbors. And so as a child, I grew up in the 80s. I was born in 77, but really knew myself in the 80s. You're watching this and you're thinking to yourself, well, first of all, you know it's wrong. You hurt for your parent, but you're completely helpless. Our father was very strict, and his mandate to his children were that you go to school, you do what you're told, you don't come home pregnant if you're a girl, you don't get in trouble if you're a boy. And by the time I came around, 6 or 7 years old is when I really have early memories of this type of behavior. I watched my older siblings, who were about 7 years apart from me. They were 2 years apart from each other, my sister and my oldest brother. And I watched them be brutally, physically abused by our father for simple things that children do. And I said to myself at that juncture that I wanted no part of what he was dishing out to them. So I was going to do my best and my darndest to please him so that I wouldn't get the brunt of the child abuse that they were facing. And so that meant going to school, getting good grades. That meant doing as I was told. That meant helping my younger siblings. There were two more after me, so five of us all together, and I'm the middle child. That meant that, making sure I helped them with schoolwork, making sure I was a good example. And for all intent purposes, it worked. I did not get beaten like my older siblings. And unfortunately for them, they got to a point where they could not sustain it anymore. My oldest brother was exhibiting the violence that he was experiencing at home, in school, and with his friends. So he was expelled from two different not elementary schools, high schools, by the time he was 15. And he went on to join a gang, a local gang, and butted heads with our father. And so we had two houses. We lived in one, and we rented out another. He had to move over because he would physically come to blows with my father, and my father wanted no part of that, because now he was bigger and older and taller, and so he let him move out. And my sister, the last beating she got was in front of our house, and she fled the scene. He ripped her blouse down during the attack, and she fled, and she never came back home. And so it was just myself and my two younger brothers home in this setting where we were witnessing, again, our mother brutally being abused. And there was nothing that I could do about it. There were many times that I was so frustrated watching this because I couldn't understand, one, why he was doing it. I loved him on one end, but I was completely hateful and resentful of the attacks that he exacerbated on her. And then on the other end, I love my mother, but I resented the fact that she stayed. Oftentimes she would flee, run, like literally run for her life, escaping a particular attack. And I would often say to myself, sometimes she would take us, the two younger ones, because our last brother wasn't around for more than a few years. And so sometimes she would take us and run, and I couldn't understand why she wouldn't stay gone. And so as a child, I became resentful that she would go back, right? Because in my mind, I would say to myself sometimes, well, he's saying all these things to make us think that she's doing a very bad job, to make us think that she's a very bad wife, to make us think that she's not a good person. But then on the other hand, I would see, when this wasn't happening, that she was a really great mom, and she was doing the best that she could. So I resented the fact that she stayed because I believe she deserved better. Right. I didn't understand at the time that she was in survival mode, right? Until many years later. And so that happened for 15 years. This was our complete normal. I continually told myself that when I got older, I was going to become a lawyer so that I could put people like my father in jail, because I wanted him to never be able to touch him or our older siblings again. I ended up migrating to the States, and I'm going to move to our next slide, because as I talk about, what the next set of experiences were, I'd like you to sort of, touch on some of these things that are screaming out from the power and control wheel, right? Where domestic violence breeds and grows, right? This is what abusers prey upon, the power and control that they seek to have and over someone else that they claim to love. And so for all the years that I knew myself up until, I migrated to the States. I was 15 when I first moved to the States to finish high school. My father let me migrate to the States because he believed that I had a great opportunity to, have a lot of more opportunities here than I would on the island. And so I migrated, leaving my siblings behind, leaving my mother behind. And I came to live with my grandparents who lived in Dorchester at the time, since the 70s. So now it's 1993. I go to school, I do really well. And then I had to go back to Trinidad to get my permanent residency status at the time set because I was here on a student visa. I was there for 2 years. We didn't know how long that paperwork was going to take, but it took 2 years. And during that 2 years, so now I'm 18, my older siblings are older, my younger siblings are older, and we are all not standing for our father to put his hands on our mother. The very first instance when I returned, maybe about 2 weeks later after I had been back on the island, my father tried to attack her. He was, I knew his body language, I knew the tone of his voice, that something was going to happen. And I essentially said, listen, I found enough courage to say to him, I said, no, I said, you can say what you want, but don't you dare put your hands on her. Right? I said, because we're not standing for this. I called my older brother, who, as I mentioned, lived next door, for backup, right? Because I didn't know if he was gonna, wail on me for coming at him that way. This was the first time that I had spoke up and used my voice. And so my older brother came over and he reiterated what I had said to him. You can say what you want, but don't physically touch her. And he backed down. He stormed out of the house and left. And I said to myself, my God, I stood up against the monster that appears when he wants to, have an attack or, do something against our mother. This was like a monumental moment for me. So that was the first time I'd used my voice, and I didn't understand how much power it had. So for the next 2 years, the physical abuse against our mother dwindled because he realized that, again, the siblings were not standing for it. By the end of the 2 years, my grandparents had filed for our mother and my two younger siblings, as well as myself. And my father, at that point, allowed my mother to migrate to the States with me. And I think in part it was because, I think it was a lot in part because he realized that the power and control that he had over her over the many years, it was dwindling, right? He realized that he couldn't just physically go and attack her, especially when we were around. He also had his eyes set on another woman, so he moved on to some degree, unbeknownst to our mother. So migrating to the States, my mom finally had some space away from her father, but she certainly wasn't away from the emotional and mental abuse that he had, given her over the years. It took a lot longer for the physical, for the emotional and verbal abuse to sort of leave her, because he could still call her and entice her to do certain things over the phone, even though he was thousands of miles away. He still had that level of control over her. And so being here, I'm now 21 and I'm a couple years behind my peers. They had essentially started college right after high school. I was a couple of years behind. So I was immediately set on going to my dream school at the time, which was Suffolk University. And I got accepted and started school full-time at nights, pursuing advertising and marketing. And I also I got an entry-level job in corporate America. And for the entire time, as I said that would never, what my mother was, in my eyes, a victim. I didn't have the word domestic violence coined yet. I didn't even understand what that meant, but I knew that I was never going to be her. I was never going to let anybody treat me the way our father treated our mother. And so again, going to school at nights, I'm on my way to being educated. And so that was the dynamic that I wanted to sort of, separate. My mother was a victim. She was uneducated at the time and totally dependent on our father, financially, emotionally, the whole nine. Our father, on the other hand, was college educated, articulate, well-spoken, right? And charming. And I wanted to be more like him in that regard. And so I did everything that I could to be that way, right? So again, working an entry-level job in corporate America, going to school at nights at Suffolk University. I was on my way, but we were still living with our grandparents. At this first company that I had worked at, there was many times that I would have to go up to a floor where I would have to drop off paperwork for the vice president, and in a secretarial position. And so on this floor was a gentleman that would always try to get my attention. And he flirted, and I finally gave in. And we started dating. Things were great. We went out on these lavish dates, picnics in the park, walks on the beach, walks down Boston Common. I think that was our very first date. And it was like something out of a Hallmark movie. And the entire time I kept saying to myself, what did I do to deserve this level of attention? And I was so infatuated that I missed so many red flags at the time. That level of attention that was so, zoned in on what I was doing, where I was at any given point. I missed all of that because I was so enamored with the gestures that it was coming at me. So in any case, we're dating for 3 months and things are great until one morning I called my office. Now I'd moved on to another company in the banking and finance world. And he called me one morning very irate because he hadn't heard from me all morning. Again, another red flag because he would always check up on me. And before I even got to work, I would get at least 3 to 4, 5 calls before I even got to my desk. I didn't understand that he always wanted to keep tabs on me to make sure I said where I said I was going to be. And so this particular morning, I had started suffering from allergies, which I still do today. I always have my tissue handy because it's allergy season, right? And so I didn't know what it was at the time. I'd never experienced it before. And so I called the office to let them know that I would be late. I'm sorry, I wouldn't be coming in for the day, and I would see them the next day. And they said, okay, no problem. But I was so out of it that I just went back to bed. And I figured I would talk to him at some point during the morning because that's something that always happened. And so going back to bed, about 10 minutes later, I finally kind of heard my phone vibrating. I turned off the ringer. And I picked it up, and he was very irate on the other end of the phone, wondering why he hadn't heard from me. And I explained to him that I was sick, but he didn't take that for a legit answer. He hung up the phone in my ear, and within 20 minutes, 15 minutes, he was at my house. Everybody had gone to work, and we lived in a 3-story house, and I lived on the first floor with our grandparents. And so he stormed past me into the bedroom that I occupied. And I went in behind him, and he was acting insanely paranoid. So rummaging through my stuff, looking under the bed, in the closet, behind the curtain, and then spewing some really outrageous claims that I had stayed home to be with someone. He knew that I had to be cheating on him. He knew that he couldn't trust me. And I'm sitting at the edge of the bed wondering what the hell is going on, because this isn't the person that I had been dating for the past 3 months. And it was almost like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde scene. And so he comes up to me on the bed. And the more I try to tell him that I love you, I'm only dating you, I only want you, it meant nothing. He came over me, stood over me as I sat on the bed. And then he said, I knew you were too good to be true. And then slapped me so hard, I saw stars. And then he stormed out. And I'm sitting there holding my face, trying to figure out, what did I just do to cause that? Like, was that my fault? I started questioning myself. And then I caught myself after about 5 minutes, tears streaming down my face in pain. And I'm like, you know what, Lovern, you don't have kids with this guy. You're not married to him. So I immediately was comparing what my mother had went through with what I had just gone through. And I said, no, we're not going to do this. I am not going through this with this guy. I'm done. And so for an entire weekend, I was done, right? Until he showed up while I wasn't at home that Sunday night, the following Sunday night, with 24 purple roses, my favorite color. And he dropped them off with a card that read, I love you, I miss you, I'm worried, call me. I had turned off my phone because I didn't want to hear from him. And I really was trying to sort of pull myself back from the amount of feelings that I had for him that were true and honest and pure. And I was really trying to focus in on the hurt that he had caused me that particular time. However, when I saw these roses, when I saw the card, when I turned on my phone and I had a slew of messages from him saying that I'm sorry, I overreacted, I love you so much. Just call me. I'm worried. I was like, maybe I am overreacting, right? And maybe I could give him the floor to explain himself. And I did. And when he related that apology to me, in essence, I fell for it. I stood there and I once again compared my situation to what my mother had went through. And I said, you know what? It's not that bad. You know what? It was just a slap. You know what? He said, I'm sorry. He said he's not going to do it again. In that apology, however, I again missed a huge red flag where he in part put part of the blame of that attack on me, because he said in part that I love you so much that you made me do that. You made me feel the way I felt because I didn't hear from you. So uh, I was listening, but I wasn't really comprehending. And again, in that moment, started accepting part of the blame. I accepted that apology in full. I did believe that I had regained control of the situation. He did apologize. He went to elaborate lengths to apologize. So guess what? It's not going to happen again. And I thought to myself, I got this, right? It's not going to happen again. And that accepting that apology translated into almost 2 years of verbal, emotional, and physical abuse. And after that, I never received a physical slap. It moved from slapping to sometimes strangulation to punches about the upper body and the upper torso, pulling, dragging, yelling. I would say maybe about by 6 months in, I was completely isolated from family and friends because he was always, and this was also in the beginning that I had missed as well, he would sometimes question who I was talking to, how long I was talking to them for, especially on the onset, if it was a guy friend of mine that I had known for many years. I know a lot of guys, and he was always sort of questioning, so why do you have to talk to him? And again, this was in the 3 months that things were, I thought, great. And, all these subtle things that then sort of full on came like it was, night and day. The relationship went from glossy and honeymoony to full on, just being on my guard and being on my A game, because I always needed to fix things. I was always the cause of it. I was being told I was always the one that could make things better. If I did this, then this wouldn't happen. And I took that. I took that all the way to the bank, to the point where by 6 months, as I said, I was completely not speaking to, any guy friends of mine. I probably had 1 to 2 girlfriends that I was allowed to freely talk on the phone with. And even then, I felt like, too much time on the phone would be questioned with them. Wherever I went, I needed to check in. If I was talking to, random strangers that, maybe I needed directions from, or he, saw a call log in my phone that wasn't recognized, I would get, beat on for it. There was one particular night that he had picked me up from school, and I, understood the lay of the land then, when the security guard was standing in the foyer with me, waiting for him to pick me up. And when he pulled up and I got in the car, he was irate that the security guard had been standing next to me, that he was, the fact that he was even there. He wanted to know what type of conversation we had, how long I was talking to. I mean, it was just insane, paranoid, jealous behavior. And granted, there were the I'm sorries that came. It overshadowed all the abuse that was happening. And after a while, it was like, okay, this is where it's at. My mother went through this, and I guess this really is what love is, right? This is what you have to go through to sustain a relationship. By the almost 2-year mark, I was now living in a studio apartment. And one particular night he came in and I got my last physical attack from him, the real full on attack, I should say. And that's the night I got to my breaking point. He had arrived at around 9 o'clock the night before. And I knew something was going to happen just by his demeanor and the way that he was speaking. And I said, what's wrong? The typical, how can I help? Come here, let me hug you. Just giving more love than I could, overcompensating to make things right. and nothing was appeasing him. He started again with the paranoid behavior, looking through things, and he came upon a stack of books that I had moved with me for many years. So, one of them was a book by Terry McMillan called Waiting to Exhale. As you know, it was turned into a movie that starred Whitney Houston. And he started, like I said, rummaging through these books, and out popped a picture from this particular book. And he picked it up. I had a day bed. So the studio was really, really tiny, right? It was long, if anything. It wasn't that wide. So I had a day bed in my bedroom, kitchen on one end, and a bathroom on the other. And he picks up the picture and he looks at it, and he was a light-skinned African American. And he turned the reddest I had ever seen him. He looked at the picture, he looked at me, he flung the picture at me, which ended up falling back onto the floor, and he stormed off into the kitchen. And I picked up the picture and I looked at it and I died inside because I knew what he was thinking in his head. This was a picture of me and my ex-boyfriend from Trinidad from many years before, sitting on a beach, hugged up on the sand, looking quite happy. And this picture I had used as a bookmark when I had first migrated to the States, as a bookmark, and I had forgot about it. That boyfriend and I quickly dissolved because long distance relationships do not work. And so I had used it as a bookmark and forgot about it for all the years. And so as he's in the kitchen, I'm hearing utensils, he's rummaging through it. It seems like the drawers. And I'm saying to him, oh my God, I said, this picture is so old. You have to understand that I forgot that that picture was even there. And he came back in the room as I'm, explaining myself, with a knife. And this was the first time that he had ever reached for a weapon, because all the attacks prior were using his hands, his body. And he said, I'm going to kill you tonight and nobody's going to find you. And I believed him because, again, at that point, I'm not even speaking to my mom. I'm not speaking to my brothers. They essentially had become privy to things not being as rosy as I had portrayed them to be. And my brothers had said succinctly to me that if they found out that he was ever doing bad stuff to me, that they would hurt him. I didn't want that. I was too cognizant of the fact in my mind, this was a fact in my mind, that if my mother had found out, that if my extended family members had found out, that I would be blamed for this. I was thinking that they would say to me, what your mother, what I was thinking my mother would say, what I went through. How could you let yourself go through this? And so that night when he said what he said, I absolutely believed him. He straddled me. He began to straddle me on the bed. So now he's over me and I'm, my back to the pillow. And he begins yelling profanities with the knife up against my throat. And he started saying to me that I could slit your throat at any time and nobody would find you. And he's pressing the knife up against my throat and he's spitting in my face and he's slapping me, something that he had not done before since the first slap. So I knew that this was bad. I knew that he didn't care. The level of anger that was coming from him was something that I had never seen. I think I'd become numb to all the other blows prior, but this night was different. And so he's punching me about the body. He's pressing the knife up against my neck. He would put down the knife. He would hold my neck and strangle me. There were a couple times that I passed out, and then I would come through and he would be spitting in my face. He would be pacing the floor. So he would stop and get up and yell profanities. What have you been doing? Having phone sex with him? What have you been doing? Sending money to him, unbeknownst to me? Just really crazy stuff. And then he would start again, knife up against the throat, punching, yelling, strangling, spitting in my face. This started at about 9 o'clock the night before, and it didn't stop till about 2 o'clock the next morning. So this was a night of torture that I endured. And when it was done, he laid down next to me like nothing had happened. I think he was just tired. He laid down and he went to sleep. And what did I do? I laid down next to him and I tried my best to curb my crying, because again, all the other blows leading up to this tonight was, or that night was no different. I didn't want anybody in my building knowing what was happening to me behind closed doors. I lived at the time at the corner of Ashmont Street and Dorchester Ave, directly next to Ashmont train station. So there were a mix of professionals that lived in my building. And again, I always presented like everything was okay. I wanted nothing to do with the stereotype of, weak victim. And so that night when I laid down after that attack, I quietly cried. Okay. At about 4 o'clock that morning, I started to feel the sharpest pain I had ever felt. So it felt like a dagger trying to pierce through my skin. And essentially, it felt like, so I didn't know I didn't know what this was. So I'm saying to myself, well, maybe I'm bleeding internally. I'd watched enough Lifetime for me, you, and the whole scope of everyone on this call. Okay, so I knew to myself that something was wrong based on what I'd seen on TV and the way my body was feeling. I'd never felt like this before. So I was like, okay, maybe I'm internally bleeding. Maybe a bone is broken and that's what's trying to, pierce through. And I had a choice to make. Do I stay here and let these injuries linger, whatever it is, or do I get myself to a hospital and try to figure out what's happening with me? And I made the choice to figure out what was happening with me. I didn't know where I was essentially with what I wanted to happen to him, but I knew I wanted the abuse to stop. I quietly got up that morning, the wee hours of the morning, put on a pair of jeans, a top, and I limped downstairs. I was in a lot of pain. And I went out to the front of my building, again, living next to a train station. There is always cabs, transportation. And I jumped in the first cab I saw and I asked him to take me to Cartney Hospital, which was maybe about a 3-minute drive from my building, not very far. At the very first lights that we intersected, it turned red. And it was at the intersection of Gallivan Boulevard and Dorchester Ave. My abuser realized that I was gone and he pulled up next to the cab. And he started yelling out, "Get out the effing cab. If you don't, I'm going to kill you. You got to talk to me. You better stop. I don't know what you're trying to do. I don't know where you're going." So he's yelling all of this stuff, toward me. And I'm saying to the cab driver, I said, "Please, I am begging you, run the red light if you have to, but please drive away." I said, "If you let me out of this cab, I'm as good as dead," because that's my ex-boyfriend. So in that moment, I had decided that I was done with the relationship, right? I'd never said that before. But again, I still didn't know where I was with what I wanted to happen to him. The driver thankfully adhered and listened to me and ran the red light. When he started driving away, my abusers then started drag racing the cab. When he saw that the cab took a left into Carney Hospital, he sped away. I did not understand in that moment that he thought that I was going to finally say something about what he had been doing to me for those couple of years. I didn't understand the level of power, again, that my voice had. Again, all I wanted to do was make the abuse stop. So I went into the ER, right? So this is like 5 o'clock in the morning, right? And the triage nurse asked me, what happened? Well, I had already come up with an excuse. I said, I fell in the shower and I hit here and I hit here, pointing out the parts that that hurt, really, really hurt. And she ordered x-rays. I get the x-rays. I go into the little room with the curtain and I'm waiting for the ER doctor to come in. And he comes in and he looks at the x-rays and he pulls up his little rolly chair and he says, "Who did this to you?" And he said, "Because these injuries aren't consistent with you falling in the shower." And he stopped me in my tracks. I had no words because I'm wondering, my God, of course he can tell, like, right? And then he said, "I can get you help." And help to me, that was the most daunting word I had ever heard up until that point. It was like a whole ton of bricks coming at me because help to me meant the police getting involved. It meant my mom finding out. It meant my brothers finding out. It meant my school finding out why I was flunking my first year in college. Okay. I was doing so poorly in school. It meant my job finding out why I would come back to my desk looking sometimes kind of out of sorts, even though I tried my best to cover it up, because there were times that he would show up at my job and he would accost me. He would come under the guise of taking me to lunch. So now it's trickled, it was trickling into the workplace, right? He would show up and he would accost me for the type of dress I was wearing, the length of it, the type of underwear I was wearing. He would accuse me of trying to pick up guys in the office. He would question if my hair was different. Why was it different? Was it a special day that I had today with someone else? Sometimes that would happen with, some choking. Sometimes that would happen with him grabbing me, and I would end up in tears. And I would then have to go back up to the bathroom first, clean myself up, and come back to my desk like nothing had happened. And so that the word help meant that my job would potentially find out. At the time, I was one of only two Black women in the office. And again, trying to shy away from all the stereotypes. I had learned when I migrated to the States that, there was this stereotype around Black women, that we were loud, that we brought drama. And I absolutely didn't want my job to think that that was me, that I was bringing drama to the workplace, right? I was thinking that they would fire me, right? If they knew that any of this was happening. All of these things are what help meant to me. And I wanted no part of it. And so I fessed up to the doctor. I did say that I was attacked by my boyfriend. I did have like a little laceration on my head. And so I fessed up. I told the truth. I said, but I'm begging you, please do not call the police. Please, I'm begging you. I just want to go home and be safe. I want to be done with this all. I didn't understand that that was the most dangerous time for me. Leaving is the most dangerous time for victims, right? And so the issue of just getting up and leaving, which I thought I could do, was not as easy as it looked. And so I went home. It ended up that I had upper torso and upper hip contusions, which meant that he had punched so hard that the inner flesh was swollen and bruised. And it could be treated with medication and ice. And I, got my prescription filled that morning. I went home, and for 2 weeks, things were quiet. I was again questioning myself whether or not I had done the right thing, whether or not I had overreacted after the worst attack that I had endured. All these things were kind of running through my head. What was going to happen when we finally spoke? Was he ever going to call? Because I was trying my best not to call him. And for 2 weeks, things were quiet. I didn't understand that for those 2 weeks, he was waiting to see if any heat was coming his way. Because again, he, I believe, drove away with the idea that I was finally going to say something. So hearing nothing for 2 weeks, no police, no brothers showing up at his door, no nothing. He called me 2 weeks later as if nothing had happened. Hey, what's going on? I'm going to come over later. No, you're not. I am done. You almost killed me 2 weeks ago. And he said, man, you looked for some of that. And it was in that statement that reiterated to me why I needed to be done. Because here, I know that I had done nothing wrong, but he was blaming me yet once again. And so, that being said, to sum up the story, he couldn't take no for an answer over the phone. He then showed up at my apartment. I had had the building locks changed at the time. My apartment building had me pay for the locks because I was potentially putting other people in danger. Obviously, that's not the case anymore. People are not are required to pay to change their locks due to domestic violence. So anyway, I had my locks changed, and that meant the main door of the building was still accessible to mailmen, but the main door to get buzzed up had been changed, as well as my lock to my physical studio. And he wouldn't take no for an answer and showed up. And what he did was he waited for someone to let him in the building or to, come out. And then he sort of slipped himself in. And the next thing I know is that he was knocking at my door saying that he needed to talk to me. And I said, no, you don't want to talk. I know what your talk is. And it's not, one-on-one lovey-dovey stuff. And so he couldn't, again, take no for an answer. went back to his car, came back with like something like a crowbar is what I got to understand later on, and started banging the door with his physical body, but also using something like a crowbar to get in between the locks to gain access. I finally that day called the police, still not giving his name up because I wanted, again, the abuse to stop and for him to leave me alone. And I wanted him to know how serious I was. So somebody is trying to break into my apartment, is what I told the dispatcher. When he realized that I really was talking to someone, because initially he told me I was bluffing, I couldn't understand why he would say that. But when he realized that I had tried my landline and it was dead, and I had a cell phone that he knew that I typically didn't reapply minutes to. It was a prepaid phone. I typically didn't reapply minutes to it till evening time. He knew my schedule in and out, right? So I didn't have any minutes on it, but I heard in passing that you could still make 911 calls, even if your phone has no minutes. And so I called 911, and when he realized that I was actually talking to the police, that's when he fled the scene, and I heard silence. And the next knock I heard on my door was Boston police. Boston police came, and I told them that I tried to call them from my landline. They asked me where my phone lines were. They went to the basement, and it turns out that he had cut the phone lines in the basement before he had come back upstairs to gain entry to the door. He had all intent purposes of gaining entry and making sure that I had no access to the outside world. So that happened. And I did not stay at my apartment that night. They cautioned me to stay somewhere else, which I did. And then again, thought that I would be okay. Granted, I was living in fear. I said to myself, well, maybe he got the message and he's not going to come back. That was not the case, because it then turned into stalking. He started leaving derogatory notes on my car. So he knew that he physically couldn't come at me because he saw that I had called the police, and that he knew that I would probably do it again and he could probably get caught. So now he found other ways of exacerbating, again, power and control by leaving really nasty notes on my car every morning, letting me know that he could see me at any time. He knew where I was at all times. And the notes were of a nature that if anybody walked by and saw them, I mean, it read, vile things. Anybody that S. Lovern is getting sloppy seconds. I mean, it was really nasty notes that if my neighbors walked by, again, shame, right? And so I would have to fish them off of my car. It was at that point that a girlfriend that I was still in contact with cautioned me to go to court and get a restraining order. And I did. And thankfully, that kept him away. But many victims do not get that chance, right? Often we hear of these stories where, she was getting ready to leave and he killed her. She was getting ready to leave and take the kids. He killed her and the kids. She was getting ready to leave and he killed himself, her. The kids are now here to survive, and vice versa, right? He was getting ready to leave and she snapped, right? So because it goes both ways. And so living through that ordeal was one thing, and surviving was also another. But 10 years later is when we sought to form Love Life Now, after I took part in 2 local beauty pageants and was asked to pick a platform, and domestic violence was an easy choice. But pointing out the signs of abuse for me, and educating and talking about this issue day in and day out, is where it's at, and why Love Life Now exists. And so during my story, I left the power and control wheel up because I really wanted to point out some of the things that I had experienced in the relationship, as well as my mom, right? There were a lot of similarities, and I'd like for you at the end of this presentation to sort of point those out to me. What were the similarities? Even though I thought our situations were so different, they were really a lot the same, right? The only thing that separated us was class, right? So my mother, again, was financially dependent on our father, and I was independent, right? My level of education, I had more than her, and she barely had any. But everything else intersected for more intent purposes than not. And so one of the big reasons that we do this work is to show that anybody can go through this issue. It doesn't matter your race, your economic background, where you come from, and that these ACEs, the more that you have these adverse childhood experiences, even though in your mind you physically tell yourself that this is never going to happen, they follow you. These ideas and these ideals and these traumatic experiences follow you into adulthood, and you're more susceptible to these types of relationships. So I'm going to go over the power and control very quickly. I know many of you know it, but using intimidation. There were many times that he would tell me, if you go and you tell your brothers, well, I might have to hurt them. I know that he didn't have strength for them, but I chose to believe that he potentially could make drama for my brothers. And I didn't want them getting hurt. I didn't want them getting involved in something that could potentially get them hurt. So, making someone afraid by, saying that they're going to abuse someone else in the family, abusing pets, smashing things, never ever really sometimes using a physical attack, but gestures and, these kind of menacing behaviors. A lot of what I experienced, even when there was no physical attack happening, his body movements would say to me that I need to fall back. I need to sort of let him be. Emotional abuse, so the name calling, the playing mind games, the humiliating someone. I got judged, so he loved to see me dressed up in his presence, but behind closed doors, it was breaking down the social butterfly that I was when we met, down to a mere, meek, mild person, right? That, adhered to everything that he said. And he was quite successful of it, because prior to meeting him, I was this person, right? I was Lovern. And almost 2 years into the relationship, I lost who I was, because always putting blame on me, making me feel like I was, less than. And he really, really did a great job of breaking me down at the time. And it's what a lot of victims face when they're in these types of relationships. So I mentioned isolation. It was almost instantaneous, again, within 6 months, that I got to the point where I didn't want anybody to know. I would hear from him that they don't understand us. It was almost like a Bonnie and Clyde type of mentality. Me and him against the world, right? Because people, on the outside don't understand what our love is. The minimizing, the blaming, again, deflecting all of the blame on me throughout the relationship, making sure that I knew that it was in part, almost every time, my fault. And he never accepted accountability or responsibility. Sometimes using children, right? So making children feel that they're guilty, making you feel guilty about the children is what I meant to say. If you leave, I will make you look like the worst parent in the world. If you leave, how dare you take my children, because you can't take care of them yourself. You're never going to survive without me. Children saying that, if you do leave, I will kill the kids, right? So it's almost like you're in a rock and a hard place, that you can't go anywhere. I asked my mom many years later, after we had migrated to the States, and I'd started doing, the Love Life Now work, why did she stay? And I regret ever asking her that, and I'll share why. Because she was in survival mode. I didn't get that she was in survival mode. I didn't get that this had nothing to do with her. That had everything to do with him, his insecurity, his jealousy, his want to have power and control, right? But my mom's answer at the time was that she knew that she could not take care of 5 children on her own, something he had said to her many times, and that she loved him. They met when they were 19, and this was primarily the only love she knew, and really counted herself as nowhere to go, because everybody else had judged her for always going back. So then in the same sense as my father, using that privilege, right? So he had more money. He had the ways and means. He threatened that if she left, that she could never survive. She believed it. And, sometimes it's just being who you are gender wise, right? In the system, you have sometimes there is more power because, some folks are more apt to listen to a man than a woman, right? And so using that privilege keeps victims in a corner a lot of the times, and really sometimes makes them go back, is the cause or the reason that they go back. Because they understand they don't have that privilege. They understand that they're, fighting a losing battle sometimes in their heads, right? And so, as well as, I also conform using privilege with using economic abuse. So preventing someone from working. Sometimes people come here under the guise of, let's say an immigrant, right? So a citizen leaves here and goes to another country and says, I'll bring you here, I'll bring you to the States, we'll get married, you'll have a job, you'll have citizenship, you'll have, a permanent residency, whatever. And they move from their country and then they come here and then there's no marriage. There's sometimes, no permanent residency, but abuse ensues. And so the idea is that I won't let you work. Even if you can work, I'm going to take control of the money. Even if you try to leave me, I'm going to tell you that you're going to get deported, not understanding that ICE and the police don't work together. There are many, many reasons why victims end up staying in these relationships. And that's going to bring me to, spotting signs of abuse in an abuser, right? So the idea is that you don't focus on why victims stay, but really, even if you're on the outside looking in, spot signs that you can potentially help a victim that is in that type of relationship. So, they're putting down your friend or your sister or your brother, and they constantly don't want you around family members to witness that type of abuse. Or maybe they're doing it in front of you and you understand that that's not what your sister or your family member or friend deserves, right? So you're checking that box. You're seeing or you're hearing from your friend that this person has an unpredictable temper that can flare up at any time, and you're checking that box. They're threatening to commit suicide if she says she's going to leave. You're checking that box. So all of these things, I don't think it takes all of these boxes to have them checked for something for you to be like, oh, red flag, and say to your friend that I can help you, right? And we're going to move on to that in just a second. Many of us here have children that this may be happening to. And it's really important that I always want to sort of include this because it's so easy to miss. And it's where, unfortunately, the cycle starts to repeat itself. So we do, workshops at high schools and middle schools, some colleges. And I can tell you 90% of the time, there are at least 2 to 3 girls that come up to me afterwards and say it's happening to them too. And they didn't know it was domestic violence. They just thought it was cute. This is how we roll, right? So as a parent, it's so insanely important to sort of keep your radars up, because these type of behaviors, not just on the victim side, but on the abuser side, these are where these start to perpetuate in formal relationships at high school, during middle school. And it is happening, every day. 1 in 3 teenagers will be affected by this issue. And that's a large number. And, so you see them receiving constant emails or texts from their partner. They're more depressed than before, unexplained marks or bruises. They're wearing a turtleneck in the middle of the summer or when it's kind of nice out. And you're like, why, right? Their hair or the way that they dress changes. You see that their partner is very controlling. So they want to know where they are. They just left them, but they as soon as they get in the door, they have to start texting with them. And, they have to always check in with them. They don't want to go to certain places with you that they used to go before. They don't want to attend family events. All of these things are sending out red flags. And what I typically say is that you don't come at them. You don't say you can't see this person anymore or whatever, but you say to them, listen, there's great resources out there. I just want you to take a look at what healthy relationships are, and just, make sure that you're checking off all the boxes whenever you get a chance. Here's a resource, right? And I love to point out loversrespect.org, because that just really narrows it down for teens, to really have them see it in black and white, what healthy relationships can and should be and what unhealthy relationships are. And so we talked about, how enamored I was with the cycle of violence, how ingrained it was that, And this isn't sort of this isn't the blueprint for how these attacks happen. But I do like to point it out because it does give some framework about, why victims believe that things are going to change at some point, because things start off great, right? So great dates that I was going on, everything was hunky-dory. And, then he's nitpicking about who I'm talking to, why I stayed home from work, etc. And essentially then the big act of violence happened with slapping me, and then things went back to the honeymoon phase, as we like to call it in the DV world, that things were great. He apologized. I'm not going to do it again. I'll go to counseling if you want me to, right? And this is just examples of what the types of excuses and that come afterwards, right? So I'll go to counseling if you want me to. I'll go to church. Okay, I'll talk to the pastor. Just don't leave me, right? I love you so much, and I can't do without you. And if you leave, I'll bring you flowers, and flowers appear, and things are great. Or I'll take you on a date, or I'll buy you a nice dress, or whatever. And things go back to being the way they were until something happens again. And I can't find my mouse. Here it is. So again, typical question that is asked oftentimes is, why do victims stay in abusive relationships? Which is not the question that should be asked, right? Which I've said before. But there are many reasons that victims end up staying in these relationships, and they are, some of them are pointed out here, right? So I alluded to some of them earlier. There's nowhere else to go, or she believes that she has nowhere else to go. She doesn't want to break up the family. Maybe she lived in a two-parent household, and she wants that for her children. Maybe she lived in a single family household, and she wants a two-parent family for her children, or for his children, right? Because it both, again, goes both ways. She believes that he will change, right? Or she will change, because they've told him as much, and you want to believe that. Oftentimes you're just willing and waiting to stick around because you believe in your heart the person that you fell in love with, the person that was presented to you in the beginning, is going to reappear at some point. But that never happens, right? So, you just keep going over and over again, right? Thinking that things are going to, at the core, change at some point. The amount of tears that you're crying is going to resonate with that abuser at some point, and they'll understand why they can't do this again. And at the very core, number 5, is fear. For any victim in this type of relationship, whether there's physical, emotional, verbal abuse, there's fear, right? Fear of losing community. If you lose someone, maybe you've married into an affluent family, and if you go against, the good person that you now say is doing this to you behind closed doors, you're afraid of losing status. You're afraid of losing community and friends because they're not going to believe you. You're afraid of losing your life. You're afraid of being physically hurt. There's so many things that at the cornerstone, freezes a person into never making a move. And then obviously the big one for me was the fear of the unknown, right? The fear that, on the other side, it's way worse than what I'm going through right now, right? And same thing for my mom, the fear of the unknown. How am I going to survive? What am I going to do with 5 children? I'm not going to give them a good life. I can't speak articulately like him, right? The unknown is very scary. Where am I going to live? All of these things, right? The victim believes that there's a lack of support from family and friends, potentially, right? Which is what I mentioned as before. Victim believes that they provoked the victim, right? I mean, the abuser, right? Because again, they've heard it from them, not accepting responsibility that you are the one that made me do this. If you hadn't done this, this wouldn't have happened. They may not even realize it's abuse. A lot of times, like I said, when we present to high schools and middle schools and sometimes colleges, there are people that are saying, oh my God, I didn't even realize that. It has to like, wait a minute, checking the check marks, reading it in black and white for it to stand out sometimes. Number 9, they're afraid to leave because of money, right? And, that goes hand in hand with privilege, right? And then obviously at the core, they believe that they love the abuser, which, that is, love is not that. Love is never that. Love doesn't hurt, right? Love doesn't make you feel destitute or, depressed, and all of these things that abuse sort of leads on to. And so one of the things that we do through Love Life Now, again, is pointing people in the right direction for help and really giving kudos to all of you advocates that do the work on the front lines, that those of you that are on the call, because you really, for a lot of the times when they get to you, so sometimes they'll call us, sometimes they'll call you, and right, and you know at that point where, okay, they don't know what's next, they don't even know how to navigate what, how to leave a relationship like this safely. And I really tip my hats off to advocates because they really understand unique situations that victims have to go through. I wish that was privy to the idea of reaching out for help through a DV agency, that DV agencies even existed. I didn't know. And that's where we try to help fill the gap. We're a small part in trying to let people know that this is actually a thing. Safety planning is actually a thing so that you can leave, but leave safely. So, I know you guys, a lot of advocates, they point out, knowing the abuser's red flags, right? Coming up with excuses that you can leave the house day or night to get out so that you can try to make calls or get help. Coming up with the code word. And so this is unique for me right now. Well, not unique, but in the last year, I've seen a lot of, maybe within the last 2 years, there've been a lot of videos going around where people have these sort of hand signals or codes that they're sort of putting out to try to get it, telling victims that at some point, if you are talking to someone now virtually, which is what our life is now, that they can use that to alert someone that they need help. Unfortunately, it is not universal. And what I typically tend to say is get your own code word that you can come up with if you're on a call with someone. So, speaking to a sister or a friend, or letting anybody that that you trust, that you talk to a lot, that if you're on this call and you feel like, something was going to happen prior to you getting on the call, or you feel like something might happen later, look, know if I talk about pizza, right, that, I'm going to need you to either call help for me because I possibly can't, or I need you to come get me, or whatever. Coming up with a system to, let someone else know that you're going to need help at some point is really awesome to be able to do or have in place. Being ready to leave at a moment's notice, making a list of emergency contacts. I'm just going to go down the list. Getting a second cell phone, a burner that you can keep at work, that you can keep at, a friend's house, at a family member's house, so that God forbid you need to use it, they don't have a digital footprint of where you are at any given point. That goes hand in hand with using your computer at work or a library. So again, they're not able to track your digital footprint, and obviously changing code names and passwords online. And so a lot of DV agencies are on this call, or advocates, I should say. And I really like to point out to folks, the myth that I had about DV agencies is a lot of the times the myths that victims have when they are posed with the idea of a shelter or going to a DV agency. I believed at the time when I sat in the ER as well that help meant going to a shelter. And I wanted none of that, right? So because I thought a shelter was a big open room with beds with a bunch of women that I didn't know. And that was not working for me at all, right? And so that's not obviously what shelters are. We know that many DV agencies have shelter components, and they offer, a bedroom. You have your own bedroom in a setting that's typically in a house or apartment setting, and sometimes share the common areas. You have that privacy. Your dignity is, they really do, or try to do a really great job of keeping your dignity intact. And again, I applaud advocates on the call who assist with the front lines of being one-on-one working in shelters or working in the agencies to get people placed, and the amount of services that you guys provide. So people tend to believe, and I'm telling you, almost every other day when I talk to a victim looking to get pointed in the right direction for help, they're saying to me they didn't even know that DV agencies provided these types of services. So legal help, support groups, right? Counseling one-on-one for you and or your children, employment programs, financial assistance, educational opportunities. And so I get giddy when I'm able to share that these services do exist, and they do not have to be afraid to seek it out. So obviously the statewide domestic violence hotline is at the bottom of our screen, and I like to share that as well. And so how can you become a good bystander against abuse? Love talking about this because people believe that this is a you problem. It is not a us problem, and that is certainly not the case. It is everybody's responsibility to take, to see what you can do right from where you are, to improve the issue of domestic violence across the state and next door, even right from where you live. So again, believing that it's a you problem, a lot of people, sometimes someone is in distress, in need, and people believe, you know what, that's not my business. I'm too busy right now. I'm sure they're fine. It's not that serious. I'm sure someone else already called 911, right? They'll, go live on Facebook and film the incident, and you're doing nothing to help, right? Because none of that helps, right? You always want to be able to offer help in some way, shape, or form. And primarily, it's the idea of calling 911, getting yourself safe and calling 911. You may be the only report that a victim has, with the police, because they typically might not call for themselves, right? Um, and so, getting yourself safe, yelling to distract the abuser. If you don't feel comfortable with doing that, again, calling 911, getting as much details, even if you're at a grocery store and you hear something happening in the next aisle, right? You notice that something isn't right. They're being talked down to, they're being yelled at, they're physically being attacked. Get details, right? What is that person wearing? Maybe you get a license plate after you follow them out, right? I go to levels when I'm out, right? I'm always in sort of, mode, sort of looking around mode to figure out, make sure everybody's okay. And that's the type of level of responsibility that we have to take when it comes to this issue. Again, right within your community, how can you be a change? Have you talked to your local city councilor about what their stance is on domestic violence? What are the laws in place for domestic violence? What happens when a victim calls a domestic violence agency? Because you may or may not come into contact with someone that is going through this. How can you be of a help? How can you be of a service to assist this person instead of judging them? How can you be a non-judgmental ear, to being a part of the solution? And so we talked a lot about unhealthy relationships. I like to point out what healthy relationships do look like. If you would think that it's a no-brainer and this is what should be known full-fledged, sometimes it's not, right? I'll talk to teens and they'll tell me, yeah, I don't feel comfortable talking to him about what happened in class sometimes because he'll flip out. He'll get lit up because he's like, freaking out because I'm talking to another. That should not be, right? So open communication should always be. I should feel comfortable to be able to tell you what happened today with John and not have you think that I was flirting with him or have you feel some type of way, have your insecurity come up because you know that I'm coming home to you and you know that we're in this together, right? I can talk to you about anything. Intimacy and physical affection go both hand in hand for me. Fairness and negotiation. So if something's on the table, we put something out there, I should be able to speak and we should be able to come to an understanding by the time of that conversation is over. Shared responsibility, so not everything falls on me, including arguments, right? So sometimes, you are accepting, you're not. Okay, let me rephrase that. Shared responsibility, not in the sense of arguments. You are accepting responsibility as it relates to the household, as it relates to, your part as a parent. Everything goes 50-50, or at least, somewhere in between there, right? Respect at the core, right? I should not be calling you out your name, and not just respect as it, as it relates to verbal, interaction, but your boundaries, if you have some, right? Your time with friends, again, going hand in hand for me with trust and support, because that also says that if I leave the house and go somewhere, you are taking me at my word that I'm going somewhere and I'm going to be back at a certain time. And when I come back, you're not going to be flipping out that I was out for 2 hours, maybe half hour over the time that I said I was going to be. So self-care checklists, love this because This isn't just for people that have experienced traumatic experiences, such as DV victims that are sometimes in these types of relationships, but it really can go across the board for everyone. Allowing yourself to cry, right? And these are suggestions that I ask people give to people that they come into contact with that maybe, they may be a victim. Allow yourself to cry, let that emotion out. It's not okay for you to keep the things that have happened to you in. It's important for you to let them out, right? So, and then spending time sometimes alone, right? Even if you're in a healthy relationship, this is okay, right? So, spending time alone, dates, meditation, relaxing, volunteering with someone, with a group, writing in a journal, again, letting these things out, right? We don't ever want to keep the things that have happened to us inside. That's one of the worst things that we can do as we're going through these types of relationships, after we've left, and even when we're thriving. We want to get these things out. And so finding an outlet to do that is really important. Getting enough sleep, praying, that's a favorite of mine, and or therapy, which I also go to and I subscribe to, because even as I stand here today, the presentation is called The Legacy He Left Me, because I wrote a book with that said title that is in pre-released and is in pre-release status and is going to be released on June 1st. But it dates back to the issue of me witnessing abuse in my home and having my father open up or set me on the trajectory to experience this issue way before I even had a choice. And even now, the effects of that I had experienced, the personal relationship that I went through as a young adult from 21 to 23, those effects still linger with me. And in writing the book and having to revisit those details, it really put me in a really not so great headspace. And in November, I had started writing in October. By November, I realized that I couldn't deal with everything on my own. And I started looking for a therapist, because it was rearing its ugly head, and I was being triggered in really, really crazy ways. And one of them was brutal nightmares that I would wake up in cold sweats from, right? So really brutal stuff that I can't even get into on this call. But understanding that, again, carrying this stuff, and for me, in part, it was very cathartic to be able to, again, put this all on paper. But it meant revisiting details that I hadn't touched for many years. And so I saw the therapist, and I do see her once a week. Or at least we try to get an appointment in at least once a week, and so it really has helped me, and I'm better for it. So seeking a therapist, whether or not you've been in an abusive relationship, I subscribe to therapy on a whole, because we all are walking around with stuff. So that is one for me, and then making time away from the phone. I shut off social media for the most part right around 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, because I need to digress, maybe take in a movie, pray, spend time with myself, my husband, whatever. Reading daily affirmations, keeping the positive around, right? So after experiencing abuse, there's a lot of negative that has come from that relationship, but keeping positives, that sort of remind you, right? Having that reminder that you are not what they said you were, right? You were destined to be there, and where you are isn't where you are destined to be. If you're currently in that particular setting, is really important. So always keeping positives around enough to let you know that you can do better. So that is the end of our presentation. Again, this is Love Life Now Foundation with me, Lovern Gordon. And I want to encourage folks, we do have one fund that I want to point out to advocates that can be of help, and has been a help especially within the last year and a half, is our Get Safe Fund. It sort of tries to help bridge the gap between leaving and getting safe, right? So I think I mentioned it earlier, but I do want to reiterate it, that if you have someone that, needs, a leg up, anywhere from $1 to $500, maybe again, it's a motel stay till they get shelter. Maybe it's, transportation, maybe it's clothes, maybe it's food, whatever that expense is that can help bridge the gap of leaving and then getting quote unquote safe. We can help through our Get Safe Fund. And our number, you can text or call, is 888-LLN-9876. So that is my presentation. I am going to stop sharing and bring it back to Brenna.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lovern. That was fantastic. We have a pretty lively chat as well, which is great. We are moving on to the Q&A segment. So if you have any questions, please feel free to drop those into the Q&A box. I see we did just get one that came into the chat. What are your thoughts on helping someone that wants the abuse to end, but not the relationship?
So that's always a good question, because that was me, right? I was in that position where I wanted the abuse to end in the very, very earliest. I knew that I wanted it to stop, but for quite some time, I was in a position where I didn't know what I wanted to happen with our relationship because I still loved him. You just don't turn off those feelings that you have for someone that you've cultivated over years, months, whatever. It just doesn't turn off like that, right? And so what I say to folks is that, first of all, if this is an individual speaking for themselves, I would say first, reach out to a DV agency, start counseling to figure out where you want to be, right? I know it's easier said than done that I would like for that person to leave the relationship. That's essentially because the abuse is going to change, but you can do wonders for yourself by going to DV counseling. So that's number one, is seeking counseling through a DV agency. I think that's really important because I think once you're in that type of setting, you get to sort of get upended from the abuse that you're currently in. And if you're hearing from a third party that this isn't what it's supposed to be, then you may be more apt to change your mind to being in that relationship. And that really is the hope in the long run, because you can't change the abuser. Nothing you do is going to make that better. So to say that you want to stay in a relationship that is happening, that's not going to happen with you there. It's almost like when you're in a fire. You can't put out a fire while you're inside the fire, right? Firefighters fight from the outside going in. They don't fight the fire, right? They don't just go inside and fight the fire. So you really have to try to start taking yourself out. And even if you're not ready to leave the relationship yet, I really suggest, or suggesting to that person that they get DV counseling through a DV agency, or through an advocate.
Great, thank you. Another question, what can males do to be better advocates and/or a support system for victims?
So awesome. That is our latest social media post. We are heavy on the White Ribbon Campaign because men do have a responsibility and can be a part of the solution in trying to help this right from where they are. So the White Ribbon Campaign, as I had mentioned, speaks to men speaking up and out. And so I'll give an example. So you're at the barbershop on a Saturday, and this guy, you see him every day every Saturday at the barbershop, or however long you go to the shop. And one day he's there and he's saying, "Man, I beat that bee so bad last night," or she tried her best to come out, try to disrespect me, and I had to put her in her place. What is your responsibility then, right? So do you not say anything because you're friends with this person and you don't want him to feel like you're going against what he's saying? You don't feel like he'll understand where you're coming from? Or do you speak up and you say to this person, your friend, that that's not the way you treat your wife, your girlfriend. That's not the way you should be speaking to them, right? And do you call them out? Do you say you're wrong for that, right? At the very core, you're wrong for that. And again, doesn't have to be at the barbershop. It can be at the basketball court. It can be at the water bubbler at work. How are you letting others know that you don't stand for abuse? How are you letting a victim know that if I am friends with your husband, and this is happening in your household, or I have an inclination that this is happening, I can't be friends with them. How are you like succinctly cutting it short? So speaking up, and so that's one huge way. I always tell folks, if I'm friends with your abuser, let me know, we're done. Because I'm not talking to them. I'm calling them out, number one, because that's the easy way out. You can stop being friends with them, but then you've left the victim in a very bad state. Calling them out and letting them know that if I ever hear anything, I will call the police. I'm not standing for this in no uncertain terms, right? And I know that can be hard, but that's the level of stance that you have to take when it comes to this issue. There's no sugarcoating. There's no, oh, I don't want to tiptoe. Well, he's a good guy, he's really good at work and he's really good at the job. No, in no way, shape, or form do you say you must say that you don't stand for this in one way or the other. So yes, males do have a responsibility. And again, even if it's, you don't have this happening right where you live, calling your local city councilor, really, finding out what the laws are, finding out what you can do, finding out what the local domestic violence agency here is in your town, in your state, and having that information handy should a victim approach you, or someone that may be going through it. So yeah, there are many ways that you can be part of it. And I urge people to visit Jane Doe's website. They run the local White Ribbon campaign here in the state of Massachusetts. It really fleshes out what other men can do to be part of the solution in ending violence against women and children.
Thank you. Another question, you talked a lot about safety planning. How does safety planning look different amidst this pandemic? And then a question that I think could go hand in hand with this was, do you think technology helps or hinders victims of domestic violence? We're all using technology every day now, so I feel like that's a very relevant question as well.
Yeah, it goes both ways as far as the technology piece, because during this time, and one of the very, very great things that I love about the National Domestic Violence Hotline is that they have the ability to text, to chat, because many victims during this time are not able to pick up the phone freely and call for help. They're not able to ask where the DV agency is freely, because again, everybody's social distancing with their abuser. So, a lot of agencies have adapted that. We also, you can text to chat us, to reach out to us. And so during this time, I think it has helped. And in another sense, being able to reach out and still be connected with folks that you love and care about, even if you're in a domestic violence relationship, is a plus. Now, again, I mentioned earlier as far as it related to safety planning, that coming up with a code word that you can, now, again, you may not be able to reach your sister because she lives all the way in Ohio, but now that you're sitting virtually with her, if you offline say, look, if I do this, if I'm scratching my hair, if you're coming up with something that lets them know, if I wipe my nose and I clearly don't have a cold, please, know that you can call for help. And she's all the way in Ohio, right? So, I think in that sense, it's helped, but as with anything, right? And as I talked with safety planning, not keeping a digital footprint also is sometimes hard because people don't have access to burner phones, right? DV agencies sometimes do provide those, but maybe you don't have a burner phone. So how do I keep him from tracking me in my phone? He always wants to make sure my location is on, right? To know where I'm at all times. He also wants to see who I'm texting, who I'm calling. So it's not as black and white for everybody, and everybody's situation is going to look different as it relates to safety planning. But there are ways around it, right? So again, during COVID, it's not been as easy, especially when things had initially hit, right? How are you going to meet members of the community where they're at, since, they're all social distancing? But I think a lot of agencies have gotten a handle on that to some degree. So again, you're back to sort of meeting people where they're at. So I can't talk on the phone, but, during, this time, I can meet you at a Dunkin' Donuts, socially distanced, right? I can wear a mask, right? And I can figure out what next steps are. I can figure out, where I can have important documents. And so it's going to look different for everybody. But I think during this time, I think agencies have had a chance now to get a handle on what safety planning can look like around COVID. So when it first hit, it really was a huge concern for a lot of agencies that I have been in contact with. Right now, we are advocating for Transition House out of Cambridge. So I think, since then, people have got the agencies have gotten a really good handle around it. But in the beginning, it was not so much.
And I think with that, we're out of time. We did have a couple of other questions more specific to Love Life Now, but I encourage you all to reach out directly to Lovern and Love Life Now to learn more about them. We will be sending a follow-up email, and we will include that contact information. And I just want to thank you again, Lovern, for joining us today, for sharing your story. You are incredible, and we are so grateful that we were able to have you here with us today. And thank you to everyone who attended. I believe Charlotte just dropped a couple of links in the chat. One is a feedback link. There's also some resource links there. And I encourage you all to join us for our future Victim Rights Month offerings. We only have a couple weeks left. And with that, I will let you all go. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.